Dear viewers, last chapter we have discussed with the wildlife protection laws. Today we will be dealing with environment protection and sustainable development. To start with, let us deal with the objectives under the lesson. To understand the concept of sustainable development principle, to understand the international perspectives of sustainable development, to understand the doctrines, policies of sustainable development, and to understand the role of judicial activism in recognizing the sustainable development. Let us deal with the introduction of this chapter. Sustainable development is the pathway to the future we want for all. It offers a framework to generate economic growth, achieve social justice, exercise environmental stewardship, and strengthen governance. Statement given by Ban Ki-moon. The term sustainable development has become quite significant concept following the publication of the Brundtland Report 1987, but the origins may be traced back to the 1972 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. The Brundtland Commission cited definition of sustainable development to meet the needs of the present without compromising the abilities of the future generations to meet their own needs. Future generations have the same right to a healthy environment as much as the present generation. But sustainable development means more than conservation. Sustainable development relates equally to the three domains: economy, environment, and society. The concept of sustainable development can be divided into two parts. On the one hand, sustainability relates to the question of the carrying capacity of the earth development. On the other hand, would appear to assume and even necessitate continual economic growth and ignore the question of ecological constraints or carrying capacity. Let us now deal with the evolution of the principle of sustainable development. In 1947, Soviet Constitution took note of rational use of the environment. In 1949, UN Scientific Conference directed that natural resources are human heritage and hence to be conserved for future generations. The 1972 Stockholm Declaration stressed the need to achieve better life for future generations. The 1974 Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States asserted protection of environment for present and future generations. The 1992 Earth Summit promotes sustainable development, of which one of the pillars is intergenerational equity. Doctrine of the intergenerational equity. It creates an obligation on the present generation to use or exploit the natural resources in a manner not creating any liability or encumbrances or disability for the future generations. The principle of common heritage of mankind. During earlier times, nature and its resources, including different species, was regarded to be a common property belonging to all people. The World Heritage Convention of 1972 declares in its preamble that deterioration or disappearance of any item of cultural and natural heritage constitutes harmful impoverishment of the heritage of all nations of the world. Bonn Convention of 1979, Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, recognizes wild animals are an irreplaceable part of the earth's natural system and must be conserved for the good of mankind. The concept of common heritage also draws support from the notion of intergenerational rights, which stems from the understanding that the present generation has to meet its needs without compromising on the ability of the future generation to meet their needs. Let us know about the Brundtland Commission. The term sustainable development was brought into common use by the World Commission on Environment and Development in its 1987 report, Our Common Future. This commission was set up by the General Assembly of the United Nations in the year 1983. The definition given by Brundtland Commission of sustainable development is: sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. The general principles, rights and responsibilities for environment protection and sustainable development adopted by the Brundtland Commission are: fundamental human rights. All human beings have the fundamental right to a clean and healthy environment. Intergenerational equity. States shall conserve and use the environment, natural resources for the benefit of present and future generations. Conservation and sustainable use. States shall maintain ecosystem and ecological process essential for the functioning of the biosphere. They shall preserve biological diversity and observe the principle of optimum sustainable use of living natural resources and ecosystems. Environmental monitoring. States shall establish adequate environment protection standards and monitor changes in and publish relevant data on environmental quality and resource use. Sustainable development and assistance. States shall ensure that conservation is treated as an integral part of the planning and implementation of development activities and provide assistance to environment protection and sustainable development. The general obligation to cooperate. States shall cooperate in good faith with others in implementing the principles of sustainable development. There are many international perspectives of sustainable development, which are the Stockholm Declaration. According to it, the concept of sustainable development further received impetus in the Stockholm Declaration resulting from the United Nations Conference on Human Environment of 1972. Principle 3 of Stockholm Conference states that the Earth's capacity to produce vital renewable resources be preserved. Principle 5 provides that non-renewable resources must be used in such a way that they are protected against their future exhaustion. Principle 11 of the Declaration demands that the environmental protection policies of all countries should support the detrimental effect of these policies on the present or future developing potential of developing countries. The concept of sustainable development received further boost in the World Conservation Strategy, which was prepared in 1980 by the ICUN with advice and support from the United Nations Environment Programme and WWF World Wildlife Fund. The concept was recognized by South Pacific Commission in the year 1980, which undertook to preserve biodiversity and to guarantee the continuing productivity of the workable natural resources under their jurisdiction in accordance with scientific principles and with the goal of sustainable development. The World Commission on Environment and Development. The World Commission on Environment and Development, headed by Gro Harlem Brundtland, the then Prime Minister of Norway, was asked to formulate a global agenda for change. The Commission gave its report, Our Common Future, in 1987 and declared that various human activities are against the activities of nature. The Commission observed that the effects of environmental degradation are grave and far-reaching. Therefore, it suggested institutional and legal changes at international, national, regional levels in 6 priority areas, which are getting at source, dealing with effects, assessing global risks, making informed choices, providing the legal means, investing in our future. Another major contribution of this World Commission report is that it introduced the concept of polluter pays principle and precautionary principle, which are essential features of the concept of principle of intergenerational equity. Derogatory to relationship. This doctrine presupposes that the present generation is holding the natural resources in trust for future generation. The doctrine conceived that environment and nature are the assets of mankind to be handed over by the present generation to the next. This is derogatory to human equation with nature. Polluter pays principle. This requires that the costs of pollution be borne by the party responsible. The practical implications of this principle lie in its allocation of economic obligations in environmentally damaging activities. Principle 16 of the Rio Declaration supports the internalization of environmental costs, taking into account the polluter pays principle. The polluter pays principle means the person who pollutes the environment has to pay the damages. This principle has been interpreted by the Supreme Court of India as absolute liability for harm done to environment extends beyond compensating the victims of environment pollution and also by bearing the cost of restoring the wholesomeness of the environment. Remediation of the damaged environment is a part of the process of sustainable development, and as such, the polluter is liable to pay the cost to the individual sufferers as well as the cost of reversing the damaged ecology. Precautionary principle. The main purpose of the precautionary principle is to ensure that a substance or activity posing a threat to environment is prevented from adversely affecting the environment, even if there is no conclusive scientific proof of linking that particular substance or activity to environmental damage. The precautionary principle has been recognized by almost all the major international instruments. It has been adopted by the United Nations Environment Programme. It has also been adopted by various international conferences on prevention of pollution of seas. The Rio Declaration in its Principle 15 emphasized on the precautionary principle, wherein it is provided that where there are threats of serious irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. According to Minhard Schroeder, one would well interpret sustainable development as the desired goal and the precautionary principle as the appropriate strategy for its implementation. The impact of Rio Conference. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, popularly known as the Earth Summit, was held in June 1992 at Rio de Janeiro, wherein more than 150 governments took part. This was the largest UN conference ever held, and it put the world on the path of sustainable development, which aims at meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. Some of the achievements of the Earth Summit can be traced in the form of following documents. The UNCED conference, held 20 years after the Stockholm conference, was popularly perceived as an attempt at environmental planning on a grand scale. In addition to a tremendous surge in environmental consciousness, the Rio Summit resulted in Agenda 21, an action plan for the next 10 years and into the 21st century. The Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development, the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was to provide a framework for the negotiation of detailed protocols on further issues such as controls on the emissions of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide and deforestation. The 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity aimed at arresting the alarming rate at which species were disappearing through pollution and habitat destruction. The non-legally binding authoritative statement on forests. Agenda 21 is a blueprint for action in all areas relating to the sustainable development of the planet in the 21st century. It is based on the premise that sustainable development is not just an option, but an urgent requirement in both environmental and developmental areas. Agenda 21 addressed the governments, the agencies, organizations and programs of United Nations system, other intergovernmental and non-intergovernmental organizations, constituency groups and the public at large, all of whom must be involved in various ways in its implementation. Doctrine of intergenerational equity creates an obligation on the present generation to use or exploit the natural resources in a manner not creating any liability or encumbrances or disability for the future generations. The doctrine propounds a sense of trusteeship in the present generation to safeguard the interest of the future generations. The Supreme Court of Philippines made a unique beginning in providing legal basis to the principle of intergenerational equity. In case of the minors OPESA, petitioner minors presenting themselves as well as future generations sought an order against the government to discontinue deforestation by cancelling timber license agreements. The World Summit on Sustainable Development 2002. To mark the 10th anniversary of United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the World Summit on Sustainable Development was held in Johannesburg in September 2002. The World Summit on Sustainable Development did not adopt any conventions or a statement of principles and was generally focused on the eradication of poverty. The Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development notes that the global environment continues to suffer. The relatively more specific undertakings of World Summit on Sustainable Development comprise the following: encourage and promote development of a 10-year framework of programs to accelerate the shift towards sustainable consumption and production, establish domestic programs for energy efficiency with the support of the international community, and accelerate the development of energy conservation technologies, including the promotion of research and development. Aim by 2020 to use and produce chemicals in ways that do not lead to significant adverse effects on human health and environment. Promote the ratification and implementation of relevant international instruments on chemicals and hazardous waste, including the 1998 Chemicals Convention, so that it can enter into force by 2003, and the 2001 Convention so that it can enter into force by 2004. Encourage countries to implement the new globally harmonized system for the classification and labeling of chemicals as soon as possible, with a view to having the system fully operational by 2008. Develop integrated water resources management and water efficiency plans by 2005. Encourage the application by 2010 of the ecosystem approach for the sustainable development of the oceans. On an urgent basis and where possibly by 2015, maintain or restore depleted fish stocks to levels that can produce the maximum sustainable yield. Enhance the role of the Commissions on Sustainable Development, including through reviewing and monitoring progress in the implementation of the Agenda 21 and fostering the coherence of implementation, initiatives and partnerships. Viewers, let us deal with the judicial activism that came through in the process of sustainable development. In many cases, the Supreme Court of India incorporated the customary international law principles into the realm of Indian environmental law. The following cases are noteworthy. In Vellore Citizens Welfare Forum versus Union of India, Justice Kuldeep Singh, on behalf of the Green Bench of the court, reviewed the international environmental developments from the Stockholm Conference of 1972 to the Rio Conference 1992 by citing the Brundtland Report and major instruments of the international significance. The Vellore Citizens Welfare Forum's case established that the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle are accepted as part of the law of the land, and this position was also affirmed in the subsequent cases. The judgment incorporates the principles directly into domestic law, noting that once this principle are accepted as a part of the customary international law, there would be no difficulty in accepting them as part of domestic law, since they do not conflict statutory law and are consonant with the India's constitution. Another important case is of S. Jagannath versus Union of India. In this case, a dispute aroused in respect of environmental damage caused by commercial shrimp farming in certain estuaries. In this context, the Supreme Court of India made reference to the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea 1882 to assert that the Government of India as well as the respective government of coastal states in India are under legal obligation to control and protect the pollution of the coastal environment. To justify orders in domestic law to limit shrimp farming and protecting marine environment. In this case, the Supreme Court of India first introduced the polluter pays principle into Indian law by invoking Article 130R, Clause 2 of the European Community Treaty and the text of European Community 4th Action Programme on the environment as a source for the principle. The Supreme Court brought the principle into the provisions of the Environment Protection Act 1986, thus requiring the central government to issue orders against factories producing highly acidic waste. The very significance of this decision was that it shifted the costs of remediation from the government to the polluting industries. Next important case is Taj Trapezium case, which is quite famous. In this case, the Supreme Court of India invoked the precautionary principle and ordered number of industries in the area surrounding the Taj Mahal to relocate or introduce pollution abatement measures in order to protect the Taj Mahal from deterioration and damage. Another case, MC Mehta versus Union of India, Batkal and Suraj Kund lakes case. In this case, the Supreme Court of India invoked the polluter pays principle to prevent construction within 1 kilometer of 2 lakes located near Delhi. MC Mehta versus Union of India, Calcutta Tanneries case. In this case, the Supreme Court of India invoked the polluter pays principle to relocate 550 polluting tanneries operating in the city of Calcutta. Law Society of India versus Fertilizers and Chemicals Travancore Limited. In this case, the Supreme Court of India made reference to the concept of sustainable development and recognized that sustainable development as a principle of customary international law has to be incorporated into domestic law. The conclusion of the chapter. In its broadest sense, the strategy for sustainable development aims to provide harmony among human beings and between humanity and nature. This can be achieved by securing effective participation of citizens in decision making, adopting a production system that respects the obligation to preserve the ecological balance for development. On 1st January 2016, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development were adopted by world leaders in September 2015 at an historic UN summit. Over the next 15 years, with these new goals that universally apply to all, countries will mobilize efforts to end all forms of poverty, fight inequalities and tackle climate change while ensuring that no one is left behind. While the Sustainable Development Goals are not legally binding, governments are expected to take ownership and establish national frameworks for the achievement of the 17 goals. Countries have the primary responsibility for follow-up and review of the progress made in implementing the goals. The challenges of environment protection and sustainable development are overwhelming. At the global level, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets of the new agenda will be monitored and reviewed using a set of global indicators. The global indicator framework to be developed by the Interagency and Expert Group on Sustainable Development Goal Indicators, the IAEA SDGs, will be agreed on by the UN Statistical Commission by March 2016. The Economic and Social Council and the General Assembly will then adopt these indicators. The process of sustainable development is not responsibility of the government alone, but it needs coordination of all people. And achievement of the goals is possible only when every individual feels responsible towards the utility of natural resources and safeguarding the environment so that we can provide the best gift to our future generations, a green and healthy environment. Dear viewers, today we dealt with the very important chapter on sustainable development and environment. Next session, we will cover the aspects of biodiversity. The importance of biodiversity is growing in the current context because the extinction of species is happening in the world at a very fast pace. Let us deal in the next session all the important international and national legal instruments that deal with biodiversity protection. I hope this session was informative. Thank you.